Welcome to Liberal Discourses. This is where we examine topics that may not be getting enough attention. My name's Vanessa, and I'll be your host for this evening. And tonight we begin part one of probably a three-part discussion on Lament for a Nation, the defeat of Canadian nationalism, that was published by George Grant in 1965. Now, Grant was a Canadian philosopher, university professor, and social critic. In Lament for a Nation, he deplored what he claimed was Canada's inevitable cultural absorption by the United States. His essay was a eulogy for Canadian nationalism. He was disillusioned with the political events of the early 1960s, liberalism and American hegemony. His prophetic tone stemmed from a belief that Canadians were complicit in prioritizing economic integration with the USA over independence. In the book, Grant laments what he views as a philosophical surrender to the inevitable forces of modernity, where Canadians accept necessity over higher goods like national heritage and purpose. The book became a unexpected bestseller and sparked a wave of nationalist sentiment in Canada, which influenced both left and right wing thinkers, and was later recognized as one of our country's most important works. Grant was a philosopher who was influenced by conservatism, Christianity, and anti modernism. And Lament for a Nation explores fundamental questions about Canada's identity, the conflicting loyalties to Britain, Quebec, and the US. He was warning against the erasure of distinct national traditions in the face of global homogenization, or at least in this case, that would be what you would see it as today. Back then, it was more continentalism. So, in an echo of what we're seeing today, Grant says that growing up in the 1920s in Ontario, they took it for granted that they belonged to a nation and that the character of the country was self evident. Which brings me to my guest this evening. I'm joined in this discussion by Right Wing Nuck. He's a Spaces contributor and paleocon, and I've been having conversations with him on metaphysical drivers in society that used to be well understood. Our outlooks are a little bit different. I tend more towards the practical end of political and economic points that Grant is talking about, whereas right wing is a little bit more attracted to the philosophical and metaphysical. So, as we go through Lament for a Nation, I think we should be able to cover a fair bit of territory that's going to be quite diverse. So, but thank you so much for joining me, Right Wing.
Hey, thank you for having me. Yeah, this is a great endeavor, and I'm looking forward to going over it with you. And I really think the meat of the ideas that we're going to speak about are going to be very helpful for looking at the climate of Canada politics in the present day.
Well, it certainly does seem to have a lot of echoes. The book from 1965 has a lot of echoes with what we're seeing today. I mean, we're trying to define what it is about Canada as a nation that sets us uniquely apart from our American cousins. And it's something that we've been wrestling with since Trump mentioned the 51st state. And we discovered that the very best we could reach for were hockey, Tim Hortons, and defining ourselves as not American, which is not the same as defining what is Canadian. So, and all of this is the attempts to stir up a sense of nationalism or national pride. So, um, maybe the best place to start is to kind of define what is nationalism? What do you see it as? What's the contemporary definition? What do you think, right wing?
Sure. So I'll start off with the Oxford definition, just what it is. That the Oxford definition is as follows: the desire or aspiration by a group of people who share the same race, culture, language, etc., to form an independent country. Now, for me, how I would describe it for Canada would be that nationalism at its core is loyalty to the nation, and this is key, seeing it as a living organism, a people bound by blood, history, and shared destiny. Now, for Canada, this means honoring our founders, the British and French forefathers, the Loyalists who rejected Yankee republicanism, the Quebecois who preserved their Catholic faith and language against assimilation, and the partnerships made to help build the nation through trade lines and navigation with the Native Americans. It is not the modern liberal concept of multiculturalism, which instead of seeing the different ethnic groups as distinct oil paints on a color palette with individual bright colors of paint that can be added individually to the complex painting of Canada, This liberal progressivism looks to dilute our essence with endless imports, turning us into a bland extension of materialist globalism, a Canadian melting pot, essentially an international airport where everything is chaotic and the paints are all mixed together, unless an elevated status can be made from a particular group to use as a victim cudgel for leftist political gains. I would say that true Canadian nationalism is bicultural at heart, protecting the English Protestant work ethic and French communal spirit as the twin pillars that built this confederation, with olive branches to synergistic immigrant groups underneath the national umbrella. Now, when it comes to economics, nationalism should be defined as the drive towards achieving sovereignty, plain and simple. Now, myself, as more of a paleocon, I want anti interventionalist policy for overseas conflict and some type of protectionism, and potentially a future where tariffs could help shield our industries and protect our resources so they're not siphoned off to China. But I also understand you can't put the cart before the horse. And tonight we're going to talk about John Diefenbaker and his vision, how George Grant points to many failures in the thinking and methods of the small town Saskatchewan Protestant. So I think a nationalist Canada needs to trade on its own terms, not be a subservient branch. But to do so, there must be economic will and incentives from the top. Nationalism ideally rejects free trade deals as they would theoretically hollow out the nation, sending jobs south while flooding us with cheap foreign labor and cheap products that can't be made for the same price domestically. And tonight, as we analyze the past, I think one of the biggest things to take away is how the theoretical ideas have so many practical disconnects in political theory. And a perfect example is here. Until there's a will and capital to produce en masse domestically, for the immediate growth of Canada, there is a strong argument to be made that there's great benefit to have free trade with America, which is one of the contradictions that Grant points out in the 60s. Now, for the final part of the definition, this puts us in the realm of the spirit, the organism of Canada. I think this is very important. What is the spirit of nationalism? You'll hear me use this term a lot tonight. And I think it can boil down to a sense of pride for the nation and the past, along with vigilance. We stand against the Hollywood poison and Silicon Valley censorship that warps our youth, pushing degenerate progress over timeless values, family, faith, and country. And when it comes to national sovereignty, nothing is more important than our borders, as they're constantly being undermined by liberal immigration policies and mountains of corruption when it comes to immigration policies in general. Now, this isn't just because it's becoming plain to see that the government uses immigration to buy votes. And from the other side, it's not an isolationist bigotry that's the primary driver either. Rather, a slow, methodical integration that is crucial for nationalism is what we saw pre Pierre Trudeau, the type of immigration that took into account the health of the organism that is the nation over the numbers for GDP growth. Nationalism means saying no to interventionist wars, no to NATO's endless entanglements that serve American interests or the global New World Order, and nationalism means putting a stop to the needs of everyone else above ourselves. So tonight, in the spirit of George Grant's Lament, we mourn the nation we've lost, but fight to reclaim it. Nationalism isn't hate, it's love, and a fierce protective love for Canada, and I think it should be framed as such.
See, when I look at the definition of nationalism, it, see, love for country that falls more under patriotism as I know it conventionally, whereas nationalism is more about loyalty to the nation. They seem to be two distinct things. When I was going through and doing some of the background research into the history of nationalism, it was interesting to me that it's something that emerged in the 18th century, and it's very much a product of industrialization. In pre industrial societies, they were predominantly rural, and their identities were tied to local villages or regions or feudal lords. There wasn't really a concept of a unified nation at that point in time. But with the Industrial Revolution, people migrated to cities for factory work, and urban centers became hubs for creating a shared national culture through methods of standardized education, the media of the day, which would have been newsprint and print media, and to a degree, bureaucracy as well, because there was a there was a need to integrate diverse populations into a cohesive workforce and citizenry that weren't going to kind of be disruptive, right? Everybody needed to kind of go along to get along. It also meant that cities, by way of that, became the originators of what is a national feeling because they would homogenize rural traditions into sort of a romanticized folk element while the urban elites, the intellectuals, politicians, and capitalists would define what the nation's essence is. And I find that fascinating when I think of the um, urban problems that were preoccupying people in the 1960s, uh, where history sort of responds to the changing needs of nationalism and the stresses of urbanization, right? The past is always kind of romantic, and meanwhile, you've got to wrangle people together to push them in the direction you need to go because you need to move off into the future at some point. Um, and this is where looking at the where Canada is now and where we're struggling with the national identity. I mean, if you think about it, the peninsula in Ontario is where a lot of the industrial action was back in the early nine yeah, early 19th century and, of course, into the 20th century, so that's where the seat of government is, where all the commerce is, major city hubs, the St. Lawrence Seaway, a lot of exports going through there. So you can imagine that to a large degree, they were able to dictate where the national feeling or the ethos or essence of Canada was and what direction it was going in, right? Now we're struggling to not only identify ourselves, but we have these separatist movements going on as well in Canada, where Alberta certainly is taking the lead. Um, Quebec has been doing this for years, and Saskatchewan, and of course in BC, are also looking at this as well. And I wonder if some of that is merely a function of the economy has changed when you look at what gets exported, how much business goes through, for instance, the St. Lawrence Seaway, although they still have the banks and the commerce markets there for trading and whatnot. By just sheer bulk and volume, the St. Lawrence Seaway does very little compared to what goes through the ports in Vancouver, for instance, and what gets transported across rail into the United States from Alberta and Saskatchewan. So there does appear to be a shift going on as well in the balance of where if we're still a resource economy, and we are, we always have been, but there is definitely a shift going on. So this is what's kind of causing some issues in trying to create a national image. When Trump said 51st state, Eastern Canada said elbows up, and Western Canada said, "Wait a second, we have to trade with these guys." So it's been, yeah, this is where examining what Grant has written is, fascinating to see where there's echoes today, um, of what they were looking at back in the 1960s, for sure. One of them, I'm just gonna start here because I think the first page and a half actually really
Well,
sums.
can I ask you something just before you start, just based on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So the way that I've been thinking that I think we can reduce it is nationalism has to be a both a combination of will and finance working together synergistically with a sense of duty and ethics that overrules just indulgence and profits and GDP. So I think there's for nationalism in the present context there has to be a holistic grouping of all of these things working in unison to be able to achieve said goal, and then that as a unit has to then interact with the multifaceted um, intersections of the world.
Fair enough. Do you think we're gonna be able to have a good conversation with Ottawa and Ontario over that, though?
Well, that's where the problem is, right? So, and there'd have to be massive speculation into changes and on how people could be influenced to put the national interests over profits, and especially when that's combined with industry and markets, it's obviously a tall order. But um, I think that's that's a definition that is consistent, at least if you pressure tested within itself.
I would tend to agree. I do think though that part of the problem that, and this is what we're seeing right now, certainly in the discourse and dialogues that I'm seeing on Twitter, or X now, I guess, um, between Alberta separatists and people who are out in Ontario. There's a lot of animosity. There does not appear to be any way to have what I would say an actual honest conversation. And I think we've got to find a way. Something is going to happen at some point where that can actually, you know, manifest in some meaningful way. And I don't know. Social media may not be the right platform, um, or maybe it might in spaces like this. You
Well,
know,
I know for sure that just by going over the book, we'll be able to highlight how, Diefenbaker, his ideological convictions, how they were mocked, just like how the aspirations of conservatives today are mocked by CBC and by really the same spirit of groupings of people. And I think outlining as we continue to outline these ideas, I think that'll hopefully it'll become more illuminating for anyone that listens to the space.
well, I'm thinking you may be right, and actually that brings me back to the direction I was actually heading in anyway. It found the first page and a half here of Grant's book extremely revealing. He actually sets it up very well because it resonates quite strongly with what we're seeing today. So I'm just going to quickly read this. He starts out. Never has such a torrent of abuse been poured on any Canadian figure as that during the years from 1960 to 1965. Never have the wealthy and the clever been so united as they were in their joint attack on Mr. John Diefenbaker. It has made life pleasant for the literate class to know that they were on the winning side. Emancipated journalists were encouraged to express their dislike of the small town Protestant politician, and they knew they would be well paid by the powerful for their efforts. Suburban matrons and professors knew that there was an open season on Diefenbaker and that jokes against him at cocktail parties would guarantee the medal of sophistication. New agreements were produced. Such a progressive intellectual as F.H. Underhill ridiculed Diefenbaker in the same accents as the editorials of the Globe and Mail. Socialist members of the Parliament united with the representatives of Toronto and Montreal businesses to vote his government from office. In my parish in southern Ontario, on the Sunday before the election of 1963, the Holy Eucharist was offered for stable government, well expressing the unanimity of bourgeois intention. Only the rural and small town people voted for Diefenbaker en masse, but such people are members of neither the ruling nor the opinion forming classes. The tide of abuse abated after the election of 1963. The establishment thought it had broken Diefenbaker and could now afford to patronize him. But Diefenbaker had refused to play dead. He had shown himself capable of something the wealthy and the clever rarely understand, the virtue of courage. The patronizing errors are turning once more into abuse. The editorials and the news become increasingly vindictive. It is interesting to speculate why Diefenbaker raised the concentrated wrath of the established classes. Most of his critics claim he is dominated by ambition, almost to the point of egomania. They claimed while he was still in office that he was dangerous because he was an astute politician who put personal power first. Yet his actions turned the ruling class into a pack howling for his blood. Astute politicians who are only interested in political power simply do not act this way. There must be something false or something missing in this description of his actions. To search for consistent description is partly why I've written this book. Now, that right there seems to sum up Canadian politics to a T. We've seen similar things now in the past election. Polyev, um, he's how do they put it? Uh, he's unlikable. He talks, too strongly. I think of the adjectives that they use. And previously with Harper, it was all about he's got a hidden agenda. So this seems to be baked in, I would say, into our media at this point. And we're talking, this book was written 6 decades ago. Um, what are your thoughts on that? The media.
Well, I think when we speak of liberal journalists, progressive journalists, Frank Underhill was the original, and as far as I'm concerned, his pen name should have been Underhill the Worm. He was a Fabian socialist, and his ideas progressed to become more elitist, more pompous, and sarcastic over time. Not very different from what we see with the CBC today. He just had slightly more complex ideas coming from a time where people did, in fact, read and build out their own worldviews. For example, he was a teacher of history at the University of Saskatchewan and went on to co found the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation through the League for Social Reconstruction, a group of radical left wing academics, and committed his life to this progressive liberalism against imperialism and continentalism with the CCF that turned into our modern NDP. So I think we can look at him as sort of an archetype that's been consistent through the years. Now, as with the liberal pundits of today, there was a great paradox with Underhill, as he supported the liberal machine while holding his anti-continental views. During this fiasco with America, lambasting Diefenbaker was in reality, although disagreeing over economic policy, Diefenbaker's ideas for national sovereignty were more in line with Underhill's democratic socialist ideals for the nation. And we can see the same kind of paradox now, where people will be mobilized when it comes to the United States, but then just completely capitulate when it comes to China or this New World Order, the EU. So in the first chapter, Grant points out that Underhill's famous lines is "Stop being British if you want to be a nationalist." And I think this, of course, is completely absurd because at the time the concern was with America's overreach, not anything coming from the crown. And this highlights the liberal worldview perfectly, as there is rarely distinction or accommodation for heritage or unity of culture. And like most leftist takes, there's a blind spot ignoring the human condition, overlooking the simple grounded needs of individuals in exchange for drastic reforms. Again, the consistent theme in the contentions of the time were that I think that conservatives lead with asking questions of who are we, where are we, what should the legacy of the nation be, and lots of these important things are often overlooked by liberals to address immediate concerns, ideals hypothetically, and then decisions are made to force new innovations onto the structure of society that are often disconnected from the needs and ideals of the people. Now, I think another aspect of this is also the class issue. We see that also today. There's the group that thinks that they are the cool kids in Toronto and Ottawa, and that virtues are made in the moment. History and heritage is not as important, and this clash is only further divided when the cosmopolitan populace becomes more and more dense with immigrants from foreign lands who don't really care about the heritage of the nation. Some of them actually think that the founders weren't the best of people, so where you could see where this pompous elitism from Frank Underhill in the '60s tied into today, there's even more contributing factors. So we actually have things a lot worse.
Well, this is true. When I looked at, Underhill, I mean, your point about stopping British if you wanna be Canadian, he was definitely a committed anti-imperialist. In fact, he was almost dismissed from the University of Toronto in 1941 for suggesting that Canada would drift away from the British Empire and draw closer to the United States, but some of that is understandable due to the economic realities of post-war anyways, when you're looking at Britain, of course, who was, devastated and basically bankrupt. The empire was, in retreat and dissolving. That really didn't leave much for Canada to go and export to at that point in time. So, just like in the Great Depression, they had to in order to stabilize the economy, it was, a matter of looking south and, for people like Underhill, who was a committed continentalist, which means he was supportive of political and economic ideologies that promoted, not just cooperation, but integration among nations within a continent. So free trade and shared governance, you're seeing that, of course, in places like the EU, and nowadays they're looking at expanding that to more of a global infrastructure as well. So something that is a supranational over and above everything. Um, so he was already supportive of that. I can only imagine what he'd think of what he's looking at today. He did write that I thought this was funny because I was reading In Search of Canadian Liberalism, okay, which is a book that he'd written, and it says in here that the test of our maturity in facing this new 20th century challenge the integration with the United States, is how sensibly we adjust ourselves to the new phenomena of American leadership. And until we have proved ourselves mature in meeting this test, we are not in a good position to indulge in sneers about the immaturity of American leadership. Mature people accept the inevitable. And I thought that was glistening with irony, considering, in light of the complete catastrophe we're looking at with our trade partnership with the United States, Trump in office, and we have gone from pulling American liquor off the shelves to Premier Ford suggesting that shutting the electricity off to northern states is a good idea, and of course, the provocative ads meant to poke the bear using Ronald Reagan talking about tariffs, which undermined our trade talks that were at up until that point progressing. So it seems like Underhill's wish for an ability to be mature and telling the Canadian politicians that we need to just suck it up and bear with it is falling flat here. So I just we're being undignified. I think Underhill would probably find us wanting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think it speaks to just the relativistic nature of the worldview, and how everything is just granted. All this this the pompous attitude is just a reflection of falling into line in the direction of wherever the innovation is. I think it can be summarized down to that.
Well, they are certainly enamored with the idea of progress. That's not to say that progress is a bad thing, of course, but I mean, there's doing it in stages, and then there's really going for the gusto and wrecking things. And if you're doing the too fast and break things, that's fine if you're an innovative tech company. Not so much if you're a nation. Um, but, I mean, these are the characters that you find in, gravitating to politics.
I think just how rich in irony it is today, but it just shows that sometimes people can be captured by the ethos of just progress for the sake of progress, with no further underpinned meaning of the direction and where things need to go. And I think that's a lot of the reason why things have spun so far out of control.
I would tend to agree. Um, what we've got this other part of the equation. Of course, Underhill was writing these things and being a social commentator. And meanwhile, you've got the media at the time, and I just couldn't. It may as well have been written today, where Grant says the jaded public wants to be amused. Journalists have to eat well. Reducing issues to personalities is useful to the ruling class. The news, and you put news in quotation marks, now functions to legitimize power, not to convey information. The politics of personalities helps the legitimizers to divert attention from issues that might upset the status quo, which sort of brings us back to Diefenbaker, because he was not a status quo politician. He was from Western Canada. He's from Saskatchewan, actually, Prince Albert, and the Liberal Part, the people who were, interested in businesses, corporate backed, and all of that, of course, contributing to both sides in order to make sure both horses are covered in the race. We're not expecting Diefenbaker to have won on a wave of populism. And so you've got this small town guy who's got a very organic, I would say, sense of what Canada should be. Is just not It's not reconciling at all with the reality of Canada as it is. But it's interesting because he in the 1958 election, there was a first one in 1957. I think it was a minority government. He ran again in 1958 and got a majority. It was 208 seats out of 265. And he ran on what he called a new vision, a new hope, and a new soul for Canada. And at the end of one of his speeches at a rally, he said, "The vision won Canada one Canada where Canadians will have preserved to them the control of their own economic and political destiny. Sir John A. Macdonald saw Canada from east to west. He opened the West. I see a new Canada, a Canada of the North. This is the vision. And then you have Lester B. Pearson, the leader of the Liberal Party, mocking Diefenbaker's northern plans as igloo to igloo communications. You know, um, this is kind of where we can't we almost can't help our we can't work together in some respects. I don't know at what point politics, the vision that you might have, and despite the wave of populism and the little people, you're being carried along by them, just falls flat because the actual entrenched, um, how do I put it, mechanism itself just doesn't want to play ball. And, that included the CBC, who also came in for a good kicking from Grant, unsurprisingly. Even he says right here, then as now, the CBC is left-leaning, and the board of, they despite the fact the CBC was created by the Conservative Party, so there would be a consistent national message, I suppose. How does that line go? No good deed goes unpunished. What are your thoughts, right wing?
Yeah, I think just nationalism and social and the cohesion of the nation needs to be looked at like maintenance for of a house. And you first you stop cutting the grass. It's ugly, but it's not terrible. Then the gutters get filled, and then eventually, and that causes problems internally from rain. But then a bird breaks a window, and then very quickly the house will start degrading and turning into the wilderness. And I think that just you speak of the CBC, creating the CBC as kind of a national arm to instill some type of national pride in the populace is, I think, a good idea. But it's unless it's holistically shored up, we can just look now and see how far things have fallen based upon financial influence and everything else.
Well, the other aim, of course, with the CBC at the time, as Grant points out, was to prevent the encroachment of private stations ruling the airwaves, where they could import canned content effectively from the United States. That would cater to the lowest common denominator. So um, we still got Jerry Springer either way. What else can I, you know? But but the thing is, when it comes to Diefenbaker, now he has this idea for a united um, Canada, but he struggles to really kind of reconcile that you have the French involved as well. I mean, Canada and the United States, Canada's predicated on the right of nations as well as the rights of individuals, right? So you have the French nation within Canada there at the time of Confederation. Actually, before Confederation, we had uh, we had issues. I mean, the Durham Report. This was after the rebellion. I think it was in 1838. Lord Durham had to come out from England to kind of give an assessment on what was going on and how to best deal with these two warring communities effectively. And in his report, he controversially suggested that the French Canadians ought to be assimilated into English speaking Canada, and that the differences were ethnic rather than political, and that the ultimately the English Anglo-Saxon should how do they put it, dominate, or win out in the end. That, of course, didn't go over with the French at all. They felt extremely um, protective of their language, their culture, their way of doing things, their actual way of doing law, the whole 9 yards. Of course, Catholic, Protestant as well plays into that. Um, but this has been the being at loggerheads with these two distinct and they are nationalities. There's no other way to put it. Has been kind of one of those, like a sliver in Canada that's been right from the get go. Um, So I don't know. And in the book here, Grant says that Diefenbaker, while he rode in on populism and uh, sort of like Harper didn't really acknowledge Quebec at the time, um, and Quebec just picked the winner. He didn't he didn't carry that forward by trying to shore up having French assistants, politicians, networks within the government structure, and that's was potentially a deficiency that worked against him at the end. There was something to be said for, having that kind of good relations. What were your thoughts when you read that?
Yeah, I think there's actually a pretty interesting paradox, especially when you see Grant's Lament for a Nation and the Durham Report outlining the French nationalist Anglo conflict. On one hand, Grant is lamenting the problem of homogeneity that is destroying small communities, especially when it comes to fear of overreach from America. And then Durham's lamenting that the French nationalism has to be integrated into the British framework better for the prosperity of the nation. And I think this outlines perfectly something pretty profound. I would say for nationalism, there has to be a both and, not an either or, when it comes to the integration of distinct groups, especially in a diverse landscape. I think this highlights the differences from the liberal individualized framework when it comes to multiculturalism, where there is no official hierarchy, but there are effectively silent collectives and blocks, which ideally for classical liberals they really aren't supposed to exist. They're essentially ignored. It's only when progressive leftists that use collective blocks then they're able to ascribe some type of minority or victim attributes to play them as marionettes in the left's broader game. So I think when it comes to nationalism, there can be a dualistic nature, not in a forced dialectic, but a hierarchy with the culture and ethics of the nation on the top, with top down support then to protect minority subgroups as a subset of the broader national pride grafting them in as unique subsets under the national banner. I think we can see this in Russia, for example, and how there is immense national pride, an unofficial but strong relation to Orthodox Christianity providing the national ethics. And then for subcultures, whether in Siberia or Dagestan, Chechnya, the citizens are both very proud to be Russian, but then also and adhere to Russian values, but they still have their own unique culture and religion. And I think this speaks to the crux of the issue that where I would see it. Is it true that John Locke Enlightenment, when removed from Christianity, is destined to unravel to create worldviews that just see the world as a means to an end for personal indulgence and materialism, where adhering to the corporate structure with the most utmost goal of GDP growth and values of endless material innovation supersede any inkling of protections for local cultural cohesion and heritage? Is this, relativistic Kantian ethic the root of the problem? And can it even be fixed in society? Like, what if there was a strong leader that espoused an unchanging set of values and a system of reinforcement for national pride with, say, top-down propaganda? I mean, we touched on that with the CBC. It didn't really work because I really believe without some sort of framework for these conditions, I think the nation will inevitably become complacent and then just start breaking down through endless progressive liberalism. And one more interesting parallel I think to notice is just international money and its integrated power structure, and how that's literally the end game obstacle for any nationalist movement. There's always an appeal to the markets. So like in the 60s, even from Grant's position, Americanization is somewhat necessary for technological progress. And there's an early foreshadow of similar concessions in Durham's recommendations for wanting more support from England and the Crown. And I think if we really look at Canada, I think it's safe to say, from the Canadian view, it seems like there are always requests for more support and financial integration. And at this point, it's when we're talking about the spirit of Canada, it's almost like there's this outlined desire to be ruled from afar. From inception, Canada has been structured this way. And if you reduce this all the way back, one could say there's not only a metaphysical desire to expand the frontier and to build here, but there's also one to be led. And I think that's also the further it's the another obstacle for any type of nationalist movement. Um, what do you think?
Well, it's funny enough that you should mention about Canada wanting to or needing to be led by someone else. Yeah, I was reading, um, oh gosh, what book is it here? Um, The Canadian Identity. I managed to find it online. I also managed to find a hard copy on eBay, which I've ordered for myself. I'm terrible. I can't help myself. I see a book, I need to collect it. Anyway, but in here, it does talk about Canada and the Commonwealth. And it does mention that imperial sovereignty, yeah, that imperial sovereignty Canadians knew, um, operated within self-imposed limits. Um, tax economy. Just trying to bring it up. I wasn't expecting to actually pull this up, so I have to have a look at it. But effectively, they we've always functioned within an empire of some sort. So there's a transferability. So we started with the British Empire. Then we've moved on, of course, into the American Empire back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially by the mid 20th century, we were really getting going with that. And now, of course, that's found to be wanting and unsatisfactory. So now we're looking at the next empire, and we're trying to ingratiate ourselves with China. So to a certain degree, yeah, you're actually correct with that. Americans have, by contrast, with their revolution, rebelled again. They were definitely individualist and wanting to, function autonomy, self-reliance was very much their thing, and,
Yeah, I think
they, yeah, go on, carry on.
no, yeah, I think that's correct, and that creates the financial conditions that we see now, where it's almost impossible to have any type of grassroots or a populist movement because the pillars of power and the financial levers are all interconnected to one international or American system, um, and I think that speaks to the philosophical underpinnings, pointing back to what George Grant, as kind of having, he has this kind of nationalist ethos that's like a Nietzschean. It's like a force of chaos and passion, um, and he's feeling like it's a do or die. Otherwise, Canada's going to get inevitably eaten up by homogeneity, by the financial machine, and then that spirit is combined with the disregard for national identity really at all. It's not even a concept. There's and just an analytical drive for profits with the liberals, and I think that that divide, that juxtaposition of that break is is really what the beginning and the continual problem that's causing the, if you want to talk about Canada as a living organism, that's what's starting to break it down. And I think with immigration, it's just compounded more and more and more. And the problem is with the large amounts of immigration, people are initially put into the system. They become pawns in a game. Their identities are used as tools to further divide and dilute the national heritage. And I don't even think this is necessarily intentionally, but probably for the most part, you can just attribute this as a symptom of this liberal relativistic ethics that's driving policy that's just there to keep the machine going and keep the numbers up. And what's also concerning about this is after these people, they're used to fuel the machine. These groups and enclaves sometimes become reliant and essentially dependent and at the mercy of the overarching control structure that accepted them in the first place, be creating constant voters and then adding to this liberal Ouroboros eating its own tail, this machine that's not grounded in anything. And I think that in a hypothetical world, if there was the financial grounding and will to create a more nationalist system, I think that a different outcome could be found by framing immigration in a nationalist structure where these subgroups have to be synergistic blocks that still adhere to the nationalist principle, a pro-national pride, and then the from the top, then that in turn sends mutual protections for each individual unique heritage and identity, contributing as different pieces to, again, a living one organism. I think this distinction is what's overlooked And maybe in the future, not today, but I think diving into the meta of these group interactions might really be interesting and illuminating for the audience. From my view, it's a universal relativism that causes this problem with multiculturalism. It'd be interesting to see what your take is on that.
Well, see, now I find you're going after John Locke. I mean, he's my boy.
Yeah,
We're
yeah, that's
talking
where I
about
know we'll have contention there, but I just as there's more to it than that. That's a gross simplification, but I kind of see it
yeah,
through that lens. I think that's easy for everyone to follow.
yeah, yeah. I mean, for those who haven't read philosophy, John Locke, he is the fellow who talks about natural rights. Okay, so life, liberty, and property. The political authority is derived from the consent of the governed, and people, have a right to basically revolt if the government fails to protect their rights. So that is what, and he also advocated, by the way, religious tolerance. That's another thing. People should have the freedom to follow their own beliefs and without government interference, so long as public order is maintained. So these are certainly the liberal aspects that I get behind, and I think are perhaps not as indicative of materialism as perhaps maybe some other things. But foundationally, these I think are good and sound, as far as I go. What do you think, Right Wing?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's inextricably linked to the founding of the nation, and all of these ideals are greatly important. But I think there can be a distinction made linearly where Locke's ideas were still grounded in a Protestant ethic, and I think that once the ethic is removed, then that's when we get on the carousel of progress for progress and never ending social financial innovation. Then there's nothing. It's a balloon floating in the wind. There's nothing grounding these ideas, and then and it evolves into this Kantian ethic, where there's a universal understanding among humans that's relative, but there is no truth, and it just becomes amorphous.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, that's leaning more certainly towards the ideology end of philosophy. For me, I tend to, and this is where I like the Italians, so Pareto, or in this case, Gaetano Mosca, in his Science of Political, in that he wrote in 1896, where he says that all societies are inevitably governed by small, organized minority elite, the ruling class, that monopolizes power and resources while the majority is directed and controlled. It seems to be you can go back all the way through history and find that the hierarchical pyramid seems to be, um, what we naturally gravitate towards, right? It's irrespective of what other kind of ethos you want to apply, ethics, laws, etc. There's always this power structure in the background. Um, so nationalism, as far as he's concerned, is a constructed political myth, okay, that fosters a sense of collective identity and unity, which prioritizes imagined national bonds over the more tangible regional or local alliances, right? But the idea, of course, is that elites are able to rally the populace around a shared national feeling using historical memories or cultural traditions, which are successful in driving and diverting attention away from those class inequalities you're talking about and consolidating power during conflicts or crises. So, I mean, that could be in foreign invasion or internal strife. So, when I look at politics, I look at it and how these things are played out in society. I tend to look at it more from this pragmatic. This is at base how humans just tend to behave rather than attributing more. um, I'm not saying that it's wrong to attribute some more moralist, or metaphysical aspects to it, but we certainly do like to gravitate towards more barbaric means of maintaining
Well,
society and
let me
control.
ask you a quick. I don't want to derail it, but just a quick question, just if you could humor me here. The what do you believe that right now there's kind of it is a globalized system that is trying to put a top down, individualist new world order type of thing that we can see throughout France, England, Australia here, and the countries that you see that are fighting them and somewhat or that are somewhat effective. would be Hungary, Poland, Serbia to an extent. And what I see with how they're able to resist this deconstruction and this moral plague, the consistent theme is that their populace has immense national pride that's grounded in a ethic that's shared through with most of the populace, and I don't can't really foresee them being able to do that and hold back this force if they didn't have that strong grounding of Christian ethics.
They do also have the benefit of having been under Soviet rule, so they've kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, been there, done that. Dealt with an overarching Soviet control centralized system where your every movement is guaranteed to be reported on by someone because you have no idea who the snitches are. Could very well be your own family. So having come out, I mean, they spent I don't know how many decades, seven or so, under those conditions, and depending on which country. And I don't think they have that. That's now the memory of that and being liberated from that are now so uh, set in their society. They simply won't have it. I yes, to some degree, possibly having the a strong religious foundation probably does help because it means there are less opportunities for young people to be swayed by alternate ideas, possibly. But there's a strong cultural memory for, well, we've already been there and done this, and we know how that goes, and no, thank you, we don't want to repeat. So there is that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment and definitely part of it. But I encourage you or anyone in the space to look into, Estonia, Lithuania, Georgia is now cozying more up to the EU and to those type of values, and there are societies that are more secular and more liberal left wing in leaning that are starting to fall, that are all in the Balkans and in that were under the regime before. So I think I initially that's what I thought also, and then the more I started looking into it, I just saw that there is quite a big distinction between secular societies and how they're affected by this, and societies that have, not a state religion, but very core religious values to their national identity.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that more. I haven't looked at it too closely, but knowing what I do of recent history, and certainly after the fall of the Soviet Union, some of these things do not surprise me. Either way, even in those societies, you still have a ruling class or that has either some hereditary or definitely bureaucratic control that will frame their decisions at certain points as being essential for the nation's survival, and that certainly will motivate the people to go along with it, but it also masks the underlying dynamics of power and how power circulates between elites and old ones as they're disappearing and new ones as they come up. So, and that bureaucracy, corporate, you know, it spheres of influence is kind of what it sort of falls to, really.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I'm just going to try and orient myself here, because we had a few things that we wanted to go over. Um, Now, when it comes to, I've lost my place. Okay, here we go. Sorry. I have notes. I can't function without them, especially when you're handling a topic this big. Um, but anyway, getting back to economic. Okay, so economic realities and the decisions that have to be made. For instance, when it comes to America or not to integrate back then, it's been an ongoing decision making process that Canada's had to face as a sort of middle power back in the 1930s, our prime minister had to go see the Secretary of State and talk about lowering tariffs. We're back to tariffs again for Canada and for Great Britain, and as possible for any other countries, because, as he put it, um, economic nationalism not only means isolation and ruination, it could also poison good relations between countries, which, so you've got two things: the economic relations, just trying to deal with things. Plus, as well, it's also during the Great Depression. So, in a lot of respects, we need this trade, needed that trade with the United States in order to stabilize our economy. And I found that was quite interesting. And this is part of the messaging I'm sure that they had to create. We need to, you know, we want to keep Canada a sovereign, independent nation, obviously, but we need to deal with the Americans closely because it is a matter of national survival. Some things, it seems like you just can't escape from.
Yeah, I think when it comes to criticisms that Grant outlined with America, there was a notion that there would need to be a healthy distance with America to keep the spirit of Canadian sovereignty alive, specifically when it came to the deals for Canada to hold on to American nuclear weapons. Now, there was a split with the nationalists focusing on idealism, while the liberal elites at the time had more of a continental attitude, as we've brought up already, because they saw America as the opportunity to expand the markets, bring technical innovation, create greater monetary prosperity, which of course I think we all would agree in itself is not bad. However, the problem that I keep bringing up, is therein lies the problem with the ethos or the spirit of these elites, or what I would say is there's a lack thereof, and where I would say that there's this religion of individualism, and there's little to no thought, or maybe even a rejection of the notion of responsibility to ground-based decisions based on, national pride or heritage, or continuation of the nation, with because the primary drive for them is just ultimate freedom and maximizing innovation for profits. And I would say that it's that fundamentally that line of thinking that's now 60 years later, is it's starting to become obvious that this combination is a race car with no brakes. Now, I think for anyone that's listening, you're probably thinking, well, obviously, what else is Canada supposed to do? America's the big trading partner. It's the big markets, big military, assisting them to store weapons and machinery. Even nukes is a small price to pay. And you wouldn't be wrong, but the distinction here that I'm making, that I keep hammering away at, is the mindset. And where I think Grant is correct when he says "lament for a nation." At the time, the liberal elites tied to the Champagne socialist journalists, pushing ever more progressive ideas, were fine with continentalism with America because of the financial benefit I mentioned. And we have to remember, this is a time before Pierre Trudeau, the Multiculturalism Act, and the 82 Charter of Freedoms. So back then, the nation was more ethnically homogenous, and with there just being major distinctions between the Catholic Québécois, the Anglo Protestants, and the Native Americans. So even if you could argue that the quote unquote liberals of the time in the 60s were more conservative than now, there was no impending sense that the values of the nation were deteriorating in free fall, and thinking this way would even be seen by many as unnecessary or even ridiculous from those 1960s conditions. So uh, again, I just want to break Grant's lament into two groups. The first, of course, you have the classical liberals. These are, Protestant, historically individualists, led by an elite class focused on the financial ascent of the nation, and at the time, seeing America as the focus to achieve these goals. And then we have John Diefenbaker, the small town Protestant that would get lambasted by the media. His conservatism was ineffective to pierce through the liberal socialite culture to create any kind of introspection or change when it comes to people's worldviews. And this became the point to mark down where the individualists became emergent on their own new path, gobbling up the virtues of old through never ending desire for social and monetary progress. Now, how are these two worldviews from the past juxtaposed against each other, relevant to what we see today? Well, I think it's quite obvious that the liberal individualist mindset has done exactly what it was destined to do. especially with the national sabotage of progressive ideals installed by Pierre Trudeau and then Justin decades after. The principled virtues and ideals of fighting the collective oppressors in the time of Descartes and Locke had no failsafe except for the Protestant Church. So, by removing Christianity and modernity, progress for the sake of progress became the driving force, and any type of remnants of anything that could be considered historical structure, whether it be heritage, Anglo or Francophone customs, patriarchal systems, Christianity and its influence on the state, all had to be slowly chiseled and picked away to the point where we are today. And I think if you saw the opening ceremony of the Olympics this week, that was a good representation of the outcome. Walking out wearing those ridiculous outfits was the representation for our nation. And if the walkouts are supposed to be a display of national strength, I think we can all agree that we failed miserably, especially if you compare it to, say, Winter Olympics Calgary 1988, where they literally came out galloping on horseback. So when it comes to America, I think the liberal ethos now sees America as a force trying to regain its heritage and a semblance their national identity. So the deconstructional, I want to make it clear, I think the deconstructional Gnostic underpinnings of the liberal worldview now has to write off the convenience of American trade, business, and military benefits and with America. And this force is so strong that now the liberal government is looking over the ocean to global power structures, to the UN, the WEF, the New World Order for these new partnerships, and I think I honestly believe that we should see this as a religion or a spiritual driving force because it's complete. From my view, I think it's completely illogical to write off these partnerships in America. And the only thing that makes sense is because it's like a magnet, a polar opposite to any type of nationalism. And I go even further to say, if you were put this liberal movement on paper as atheists, I think we have to realize that there is a metaphysical Gnostic desire to destroy what is old with renewal of the abstract, almost being a religious experience of progress for progress. And I know you're probably not going to like that assessment, but I think that uh, if there's an equal force, there's an opposite solution, and totally see this as some kind of spiritual Gnostic underpinning deconstruction of our society.
I think a lot of people have a problem trying to get to grips with the whole gnosis aspect of it. They can't, for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to work in their framework. They understand Catholic, they understand Protestant, they don't understand how, uh, being atheist can be a religion in and of itself, and how it is trying to fulfill some of the aspects of Christianity. For instance, our friend Underhill in Grant's book here belonged to the League for Social Reconstruction, which was a circle of Canadian socialists that advocated for social and economic reformation as well as political education. It was a think tank. And its purpose was to bring centralized planning to Canada's economy and its social programs, where rational moralism could be used to influence public policy reform in order to prevent suffering in Canada during the Great Depression, where there was a protracted period of mass unemployment. So, when you're looking at preventing suffering, that is something that you find within, I would expect, a Christian framework. Um, and so to that way, it sort of does mimics the it wants to mimic the better attributes, for lack of a better way of putting it. Would you say that's about right? I mean, this is more getting into metaphysics and stuff like that. That I don't follow into religious studies, so it's a little bit out of my field, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think, well, from my view, I see it as God is written on everyone's hearts, and then it's interpreted differently through their interactions in the world. And, people that are subjected to a Christian perspective, then they adhere to that. But there's from a Christian belief, there's still the belief that universally God is written on everyone's heart. So I think that when the framework and the media and when there's so much top down propaganda from a young age for people to believe that atheism and specifically the combination of atheism and scientism elevated above religion, almost looking at religion as if it's foolish. I think when that's ground in people at a young age, then these metaphysical how do I word this? I think there's natural predilections and ways that humans interface with the world that are fulfilled with religiosity that then become filled with the apparatus of the state or with whatever liberal ideology, politics. There's some type of interface there, but it becomes destructive almost, and then that's where you can break it down and see it almost as a Gnostic elevation of creation, destruction, renewal, and enlightenment through if you go deeper into the metaphysical. But I think to simplify it is that even if you are atheist, there's still you're still interfacing in the world, and you're easier to be manipulated by the the rational or the logical structures above, unbeknownst to you, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense.
Well, I mean, okay, I sort of get where you're coming from here. Probably would help the audience if they understand what moral rationalism is, okay, which is that moral principles can be discovered a priori, which means they can be known through reason without needing empirical evidence, right? The idea is that moral truths are objective and universal and guide ethical behavior through logical deduction rather than emotional responses or societal customs. And I think that's wrong. In fact, everything in sociology tells me that's wrong. When you're in a family setting as a child, especially in the first 5 years of your life, I mean, your largest influence, of course, is your parents and your family structure. After that, you have secondary influences, be your school, your TV, your social media, or whatever. But the foundation that you're gonna have is gonna be in that first 5 years. So however your family's oriented, that's where you're going to learn everything from, including morals, for lack of a better way of putting it. I remember when I was in school, this is long, I there were dinosaurs. Anyway, when I was in school, my mother went to talk to the principal because she was had been told, well, we need to teach the children morals, and my mother's like, whose morals? Morals is not your bailiwick. That's mine at home. Um, So there are always attempts to have outside influence into those particular spheres to kind of subvert, I guess, some of these underpinnings. And of course, I mean, back to your earlier mention about religion being a way to kind of blockade that, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. Um, but I mean, to be fair, the people who are falling into this line of moral rationalism, they still think that they're being good people. It's it's a difficult one to reconcile, and the problem with philosophy, of course, is that you start getting into some of the weeds that posit how humans might be, but don't necessarily line up with how we actually are in some instances. So I don't know.
Yeah, I try
I
not to. I try not to go too deep into that specifically. My position for this that's been consistent the whole time is that our nation was founded on these ethics, and then they have been deteriorated over time, and I think they're necessary to adhere to before there's complete collapse and chaos, and something else will be created from the rubble in the renewal. And I see the elements that are pushing for that as distinctively anti-Christian, and I think I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's all interconnected. That's my own personal belief. But when it comes to ascribing for set of values for Canadians, the only thing I would subscribe would be the ones that were here originally. It's not implementing some type of new, some type of strict Christian authority. That's not where I go with it. I just see it as I see our society. I see it as a necessary component to the society, even for the people that take it for granted.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let me ask you a question here because I think it's probably the most pragmatic way for me to approach this. When it comes to, because you know, um, liberalism, which is taking quite a beating this evening, uh, uh, a lot of the expectation is on personal responsibility. And would you say that in all of this, there is a rather large degree of people who wish to offshore personal responsibility to someone else. In other words, externalize it, and that's part of our problem. So if you're going to externalize it, they have a couple of choices. They can externalize it to the state, which will tell them what to do, or various groups that they wish to belong to, or that a better choice would be to offshore it to a religious institution, which have a more not just the not just a moral framework, but also it comes with things like, traditions, ceremonies, these kind of things. So that's basically what you're kind of pointing out toward.
Yeah, I think that for a nation to be healthy, there has to be a consistent ethic that represents the ethos of the nation. Why at the beginning I said I think the best way to look at the nation is as its distinct as a distinct organism, and then underneath that we adhere to those value sets, and then that's what creates the culture. I see it as interconnected holistically in a direct line like that. And then and the problem is when there isn't that, and then with those ethics, with our founding ethics, as you said, John Locke said freedom of religion, there's individual rights. All of these things have to stem, they can and will hopefully, but they have to stem from this continual ethic that comes from the organism that we can call the nation, if that makes sense. And then uh, from there, then individual freedoms, everything that made this country great. It stems from that. So I'm not advocating for profound transformation. I think that I see it completely as a deconstruction of something that was completely taken for granted, that created the individual success in the first place.
Well, that's going to make it very challenging then to find common ground. I mean, you could previously. This certainly was not something that George Grant was having to be concerned with. This whole multiculturalism thing back in 1965, we were still, on the whole, majority European, and whether or not you were Catholic or Protestant, it was still largely Christian at that point in time. So, given 60 years later, a whole lot of trending towards secularism and the import of people who have distinctly and decidedly different, not just social backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, but religious backgrounds as well. I don't know how easy it would be to find a message that would be consistent across all that you could reconcile people to. I think that's going to be part of the challenge or struggle, depending on which way you're going to look at it. And I'm assuming that right wing is just out of reach from his phone at the moment,
Yeah, sorry,
which
my
is fine.
phone's, I don't know what's happening with my phone here. So
Oh, is it wigging out?
yeah, yeah, it just cut out for a minute. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
That's fine. It's spaces. It happens. Um, no, I was just saying that multiculturalism. It's not something that George Grant had to be concerned with back in 1965 when he wrote this book. Canada was still largely European heritage, and whether or not you were Catholic or Protestant, you were still generally Christian. Whereas now, of course, it's been a distinct drift towards secularism, and with the import of people who are different culturally, also have different religious traditions, trying to find a unifying uh, ethic, I suppose, across all of them, or moral standard, or however you want to look at it, could be challenging at best. In order to make a make an attempt to create a new brand of unification, because at a certain point, we're just simply going to have to acknowledge that the actual fabric of Canada itself has changed rather significantly, especially in the last 10 years. So at some point, we're just going to have to sort of, I suppose, make the best of it. Do you think?
Yeah, yeah, but I think I disagree when it comes to classifying it as something that's so different. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but I think the problem that in this book that they're going over is the distinction in the ethics and the ideals of the small town Protestant Diefenbaker to the liberal machine, I'll call it the godless machine. That distinction is just as big um, as any type of change that would have to be made in the future to create more unity, because um, I see the liberal machine as not grounded in anything. Whereas if there's other integrations of people from different religions or different cultures, sure, on individual grounds for certain things, when it comes to ethics, there may be just different distinctions, monotheism, pluralism, whatever it may be. But I think that the adherence, the structure to the adherence, the conditioning to the adherence is there. So I don't see, and that's why I know it's terrible optically. The guy that espouses Orthodox Christianity. I'm using Russia as example. I know this is bad optically, but that's why I brought up Russia as the example, because they have this national ethos, and then Dagestan and Chechnya could be no could it's completely different, but it still works. And we could argue about how it works and it's authoritarian or whatever, but at least there's an adherence. I could make the argument that there's an adherence to a sense of pride and overarching nation state there.
Well, I mean, to be fair, rural perspectives, I suspect on the whole, um, tend to be more conservative, more religious, and nationalist, populist, simply because by their very nature they are rural, remote, and there is more of a tendency, I would expect, to sort of a collectivist type of community. I don't mean that in the bad sense. I mean simply you. There is nobody else close by. You really do have to look out for your neighbor because it's in your best interest to do so, because that means they'll be inclined to look out for you as well, right? So, you know, and that works in small communities, and small communities, although they can have various little facets. So some's got the largest pierogi, some's got something else, right? As try to make themselves distinct from something else, which of course you'd see a lot in corner gas if you watch that. Um, it's it's not something that can scale, and I suspect that's part of the problem for those who are following more of the ideological bent in trying to create a unifying message, is that collectivism works at certain points, and then past a point it just doesn't scale properly or well at all. um, I don't know if you've seen that. Oh gosh, what's his name, that comedian? He says, "Communism works great, in a family setting, each according to their needs, each according to their abilities, right? And in a neighborhood, you can be a little bit socialist, right? Look out for your neighbor, but when it comes to national, yeah, forget them, right? That kind of thing. So that's where cohesion, you just kind of, it doesn't matter what you do, you can still can't quite reach it. But I finding, I see you laughing, right wing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a delay on this face. Something's wrong with my phone. I don't know what happened. I said that like maybe like a minute, 2 minutes ago.
Oh, do you? Okay. Fair enough. Well, you know what? I mean, if you're having some issues here, I mean, we've gone over an hour with this, and there's still plenty of material. We're going to be doing another couple of spaces on this. Did you want to maybe perhaps shut things down, and we can try and pick up at some next week on Sunday?
Yeah, for sure. If that works, I thank you for having me here for this conversation. And I think it is really important, and maybe in DMs we'll go back and forth on some of these concepts, because I think we'll agree more than we'll disagree. And I think there is a road forward when it comes to this, because it is the problem of this book. It is the French Catholic versus the Anglo. These distinct these there's parallels to these distinctions throughout it, and I think there can be some type of headway that can be made here.
Absolutely. Plus, it'll give us a chance to go and explore the pipeline issue and nuclear as well that Diefenbaker had to go and deal with. So we'll get into all of that next week. Anyway, all right. Well, we'll wrap up then. But thank you so much, Right Wing Nuck. This has been fantastic. And, I'm looking forward to you poking liberals a little bit more next week.
Thank you very much for having me in this space.
All right. And with that, we're going to say goodnight. Good night, everyone.